Welcome, dear wanderer of the spirit realm, to a gentle journey through the heart's deepest connections across the Avatar universe. Tonight, we explore the tender threads that bind souls together, the loves that flourished in times of peace, the romances that bloomed amid war's chaos, and the quiet devotions that endured through generations of change. From the Air Temple's ancient courtyards to Republic City's bustling streets, love has always found a way to transcend the boundaries of nations, elements, and time itself. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and drift with us through these tales of hearts intertwined across the ages. In the beginning, when the world was young and the spirits walked freely among mortals, love was understood not merely as an emotion or attraction between individuals, but as a fundamental force that wove through the very fabric of existence itself. The ancient sages, who would eventually become the first spiritual teachers of the four nations, recognized that the connections between souls transcended the boundaries of single lifetimes, creating bonds that could span centuries and manifest across multiple incarnations of the eternal spirit that inhabited each living being. The air nomads, in their mountain sanctuaries where clouds gathered like prayer offerings and wind carried the whispers of enlightened ancestors, developed perhaps the most complex philosophical understanding of love's place in spiritual development. Their teachings spoke of the apparent paradox between detachment from worldly desires and the deep compassion that connected all living things through invisible threads of shared existence. The monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to spiritual purification did not reject love, but sought to transform it from possessive desire into universal compassion that embraced every creature without distinction or preference. Yet even within this framework of spiritual detachment, the air nomads understood that romantic love between individuals could serve as a pathway to greater enlightenment when approached with proper wisdom and mindfulness. The partnership between two souls who had chosen to journey together through life's challenges was seen as an opportunity for mutual growth and spiritual refinement, each person serving as mirror and teacher for the other, while maintaining their individual connection to the cosmic forces that guided all existence toward harmony and balance. The courtship rituals practiced in air nomad communities were gentle and contemplative, emphasizing compatibility of spirit and shared commitment to spiritual development, rather than physical attraction or material considerations that might cloud judgment about long-term partnership potential. Young people were encouraged to spend time together in meditation and philosophical discussion, sharing their insights about life's deeper meanings, while observing how their individual approaches to spiritual practice complemented or challenged each other in ways that promoted growth rather than stagnation. When air nomads chose to marry, their ceremonies took place at sunrise on mountain peaks where the boundary between earth and sky seemed most permeable, symbolizing their commitment to supporting each other's journey toward transcendence of ordinary consciousness while remaining grounded in practical compassion for all beings. The vows they exchanged spoke not of possession or exclusive devotion, but of mutual dedication to helping each other become their highest and most compassionate selves throughout whatever lifetimes they might share together. The water tribes, dwelling in the polar extremes where survival depended upon community cooperation and intimate knowledge of seasonal rhythms that governed all life in their harsh but beautiful environment, understood love as the force that bound families and communities together through the long darkness of winter and the brief abundance of summer hunting seasons. Their approach to romance was practical but deeply emotional, recognizing that partnerships needed to serve not just individual happiness, but the welfare of extended family networks that provided security and support for everyone during difficult times. The betrothal necklaces that became central to Water Tribe romantic tradition were far more than simple jewelry or status symbols, representing instead the spiritual and practical commitment that marriage entailed in communities where individual survival depended absolutely upon group cooperation and mutual support. Each necklace was carved by the prospective groom using techniques passed down through generations of fathers and sons. The patterns and symbols chosen to reflect both his own spiritual beliefs and his understanding of his beloved's personality, dreams, and the qualities that made her precious beyond simple attraction or convenience. The blue stone that formed the centerpiece of every betrothal necklace was believed to carry spiritual significance that connected the wearer to the eternal dance between moon and ocean spirits, while the carved symbols that surrounded it told stories about the couple's hopes for their shared future and their commitment to honoring the traditions that had sustained their people through centuries of challenge and change. When a young woman accepted such a necklace, she was not merely agreeing to marry an individual, but joining her destiny to his family line and accepting responsibility for preserving cultural knowledge that would be passed to their children and grandchildren. Water Tribe wedding ceremonies took place during the full moon when the ocean spirit's influence was strongest, symbolizing the couple's integration into cosmic rhythms that govern not just tides and seasons, but the deeper currents of destiny that shaped all life. The vows exchanged during these ceremonies emphasized mutual support through hardship and celebration, recognition that their individual strengths and weaknesses would complement each other in ways that made their partnership more resilient than either could be alone, and commitment to raising children who would honor their ancestors while adapting to whatever changes the future might bring. The Earth Kingdom's vast territories encompass such diversity of landscape, culture, and tradition that generalizations about romantic customs risked overlooking the rich variations that had developed across different regions and communities. Yet certain common themes emerged from the kingdom's shared elemental nature and the values that earthbending philosophy had embedded in social structures throughout the scattered cities, towns, and rural settlements that acknowledged the Earth King's distant authority while maintaining their own local traditions and ways of life. Stability and permanence were prized above passion and spontaneity in most Earth Kingdom approaches to romance, reflecting the elemental values that emphasized patient building of foundations that could support structures designed to last for generations, rather than merely satisfy immediate desires or emotional impulses. Courtships in Earth Kingdom communities tended to be extended processes that allowed families and communities to evaluate potential partnerships for their long-term viability and their contribution to social stability, rather than rushing into commitments based on temporary attraction that might fade when faced with practical challenges. The matching practices employed by Earth Kingdom families often involved careful consideration of complementary skills, compatible temperaments, and shared values that would enable couples to build prosperous households while contributing positively to their community's welfare and continuity. While individual preference and attraction were not ignored, they were balanced against practical considerations about economic stability, family reputation, and the potential for producing children who would carry forward their parents' best qualities while avoiding the kind of personality conflicts that could destroy households and create ongoing community tensions. Earth Kingdom wedding ceremonies varied significantly between regions, but typically emphasized the permanence of commitment through symbolic acts that involved literal connection to the earth itself, such as exchanging vows while standing on stone platforms that had been carved specifically for the occasion, or planting trees whose growth would parallel the couple's deepening relationship across decades of shared experience and mutual support. The reception celebrations that followed these ceremonies often lasted for several days and involved entire communities in recognition of marriage as social institution, rather than merely private arrangement between individuals. The Fire Nation's relationship with romantic love had been profoundly shaped by the century of war that had transformed their society from one that balanced passion with wisdom into a militaristic culture that often subordinated individual desires to national ambitions and imperial expansion. Before the war, Fire Nation courtship had celebrated the passionate intensity that reflected their elemental nature, while recognizing the need for that passion to be channeled constructively rather than destructively through relationships built on mutual karma, respect, and shared commitment to personal growth and family welfare. The arranged marriages that became common among Fire Nation nobility during the war years were designed primarily to serve political purposes rather than individual happiness, creating alliances between powerful families while ensuring that the next generation would inherit both wealth and influence that could be employed in service of national expansion and military conquest. These political considerations often overrode personal compatibility and emotional connection, leading to marriages that produced children and maintained social stability, while leaving both partners emotionally unfulfilled and psychologically isolated within their own households. Yet, even during the darkest periods of the war, ordinary Fire Nation citizens continued to seek authentic connection and genuine partnership in their romantic relationships, finding ways to honor their cultural values of passion and intensity, while creating households that could provide emotional sanctuary from the constant pressure of living in a society organized primarily around military objectives and imperial ambition. The love stories that emerged from this period often carried undertones of resistance against forces that sought to reduce human beings to mere instruments of state policy, rather than individuals deserving of happiness and personal fulfillment. Fire Nation wedding ceremonies traditionally took place at noon when the sun's power was strongest, symbolizing the couple's commitment to bringing light and warmth into each other's lives while channeling their passionate natures toward constructive purposes that served both their individual growth and their community's welfare. The ceremonial flames that were lit during these weddings were intended to burn throughout the couple's lifetimes as symbols of their enduring commitment, with the responsibility for maintaining these flames serving as a reminder of the daily attention and care that successful marriages required to remain vibrant and mutually supportive. The influence of bending abilities on romantic relationships created additional layers of complexity and consideration that non-bending communities did not need to navigate, as elemental compatibility, relative power levels, and the philosophical approaches that different bending traditions brought to understanding human nature all affected how couples related to each other and managed the inevitable conflicts and challenges that arose in any long-term partnership between imperfect individuals seeking to build lives together. Marriages between benders of the same element often created households characterized by deep mutual understanding and shared approaches to problem solving, but they could also intensify personality traits in ways that became problematic if both partners shared the same weaknesses or blind spots without compensating strengths from different elemental perspectives. The stability that two earthbenders might create together could become stagnation if neither partner brought the flexibility needed to adapt to changing circumstances, while the passion that fire-fire partnerships generated could become destructively competitive if not balanced by wisdom and mutual respect. Cross-elemental relationships offered opportunities for growth and learning that same-element partnerships could not provide, as partners learn to appreciate different approaches to understanding the world, while developing greater flexibility and adaptability through exposure to alternative ways of thinking and problem solving. However, these relationships also required greater patience and communication skills, as partners needed to bridge philosophical differences that reflected fundamental aspects of their identities and worldviews, rather than merely surface preferences or temporary disagreements. The relationships between benders and non-benders carried their own unique dynamics and challenges, particularly in societies where bending abilities conferred social status, economic advantages, or political power that could create imbalances within partnerships, if not carefully managed through conscious effort to maintain equality and mutual respect. Non-bending partners often brought different skills, perspectives, and forms of intelligence that complemented their bending partner's abilities, while contributing essential elements that no amount of elemental mastery could provide to household stability and emotional fulfillment. The spiritual dimensions of romantic love in the Avatar world were understood to extend far beyond individual lifetimes, with many cultural traditions teaching that souls who had developed deep connections in one incarnation would seek each other out across multiple lifetimes, continuing their shared journey toward enlightenment and completion through whatever forms their spirits might take in future existences. This belief in eternal soul connections provided comfort during times of loss, while encouraging individuals to approach their current relationships with greater depth and commitment than might seem warranted by purely temporal considerations. The meditation practices and spiritual disciplines that many couples incorporated into their shared lives were designed to deepen their connection not only to each other, but to the cosmic forces that had brought them together, creating partnerships that served spiritual development as well as practical and emotional needs. These practices often involved synchronized breathing exercises, shared contemplation of philosophical texts or spiritual teachings, and collaborative service projects that allowed couples to express their love through contributions to their community's welfare, rather than focusing exclusively on their private happiness. The festivals and celebrations that marked important transitions in romantic relationships throughout the Avatar world served not only to honor individual couples, but to strengthen community bonds and transmit cultural knowledge about love's proper role in human life. From generation to generation, these occasions provided opportunities for storytelling, music, and dance that celebrated love's power to transform individuals and communities, while warning about the dangers of possessiveness, jealousy, and other corrupted forms of attachment that could destroy rather than enhance human flourishing. As we reflect upon these varied approaches to love and partnership that flourished across the four nations, we begin to understand that romance in the Avatar world was never viewed as separate from the broader spiritual and social contexts that gave life meaning and purpose. Whether expressed through air nomad detachment, water tribe commitment, earth kingdom stability, or fire nation passion, love was recognized as a force capable of elevating human consciousness toward greater wisdom and compassion, when approached with proper understanding and respect for its transformative power. The island of Kyoshi had remained untouched by the world's greater conflicts for so long that its inhabitants had developed their own rhythms of life, their own understanding of strength and honor that differed markedly from the assumptions that governed behavior in other parts of the Earth Kingdom, where traditional gender roles and military hierarchies shaped every aspect of social interaction. Here, among the painted warriors who carried fans as weapons and moved with deadly grace through forms that appeared to be dancing but concealed centuries of refined combat technique, a different vision of what it meant to be strong had taken root and flourished. Suki had grown up knowing that her worth was not determined by her ability to defer to male authority or to make herself smaller so that others might feel more comfortable with their own limitations, but rather by her dedication to mastering the disciplines that would enable her to protect her community and honor the legacy of Avatar Kyoshi, whose spirit seemed to watch over their island with the same fierce protectiveness that had once reshaped continents to defend the innocent from those who would exploit their vulnerability for personal gain. The arrival of strangers on their peaceful shores was rare enough to be significant, but the particular combination of arrogance and genuine bewilderment that the Water Tribe boy displayed when confronted with their customs created a teaching moment that Suki recognized as potentially transformative for both the visitor and her own understanding of how the wider world viewed women who chose to claim their own power rather than accepting the limitations that others sought to impose upon them. Sokka's initial dismissal of the Kyoshi warriors as mere children playing at war reflected assumptions that had been so thoroughly embedded in his worldview that he could not immediately recognize the evidence of his senses when it contradicted beliefs that had never been seriously challenged. During his upbringing in the Southern Water Tribe, where traditional gender roles had been reinforced by the practical necessities of survival in an environment where physical strength often determined who lived and who died during the harsh winter months. The demonstration that followed was designed not to humiliate, but to educate, each movement of Suki's fans creating opportunities for Sokka to observe how technique and training could overcome raw physical advantages, how intelligence and strategy could turn an opponent's assumptions into weaknesses that could be exploited through superior preparation and deeper understanding of combat principles that transcended simple contests of muscle and aggression. When Sokka found himself face down in the dirt with Suki's fan pressed against his neck in a position that could have ended his life if she had chosen violence over instruction, the shock of his complete helplessness created a moment of clarity that penetrated through layers of conditioning and cultural blindness to reach something deeper and more authentic in his character, something that was capable of recognizing truth even when it challenged everything he thought he knew about himself and the world. The humility that emerged from this encounter was genuine rather than performative, born not from social pressure to conform, but from authentic recognition that his previous beliefs had been based on ignorance rather than wisdom, that the strength he had valued was incomplete without the grace and precision that Suki embodied, that true power came not from dominating others, but from mastering oneself in service of principles worth defending against those who would corrupt or destroy them. Suki's decision to offer him training, rather than simply sending him away with his misconceptions corrected, but his character unchanged, reflected her deeper understanding of teaching as transformation rather than mere information transfer, her recognition that genuine learning required not just exposure to new ideas, but integration of those ideas into patterns of behavior and relationship that could sustain growth over time, rather than creating temporary shame that would eventually be replaced by resentment or renewed arrogance. The days that followed were marked by a gradual shift in the dynamic between teacher and student, as Sokka's natural intelligence and strategic thinking began to complement rather than compete with the lessons he was receiving, his creativity finding expression through mastery of techniques that required not just physical coordination but mental flexibility and emotional balance that could only be developed through patient practice and honest self-examination. Suki's teaching methods were demanding but never cruel, challenging but never designed to break spirit or create dependency. Her corrections offered in the spirit of helping him discover his own potential, rather than imposing her will upon someone whose growth required freedom to make mistakes and learn from them at his own pace while receiving the guidance necessary to avoid errors that could prove permanently damaging to his development or dangerous to others who might depend upon his abilities. The breakthrough that allowed Sokka to begin integrating warrior disciplines with his existing skills came not through dramatic revelation, but through gradual recognition that strength and strategy were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of effectiveness that could enhance each other. When properly understood and applied with wisdom rather than mere ambition or desire to prove superiority over others who had chosen different paths toward excellence. The mutual respect that began to develop between them during this period of intensive training created foundation for deeper connection that transcended the formal relationship between instructor and student, as both began to recognize qualities in the other that complemented their own strengths while addressing weaknesses that had previously limited their effectiveness, both individually and as potential partners in whatever challenges the way future might present. When the time came for Sokka to continue his journey with his sister and the Avatar, the parting was marked not by dramatic declarations or promises that might prove impossible to keep, but by quiet recognition that something significant had been planted that would continue to grow regardless of physical separation, that the connection they had discovered was strong enough to survive the uncertainties of war and the possibility that they might never see each other again. The reunion that eventually brought them back together occurred under circumstances that tested everything they had learned about themselves and each other during their brief time on Kyoshi Island, as the stakes of their individual growth had expanded to encompass not just personal development, but the fate of entire nations locked in conflict that seemed to offer only victory or destruction as possible outcomes. Suki's capture by Azula and her imprisonment in the boiling rock had subjected her to forms of psychological pressure designed to break her spirit and transform her from confident warrior into broken victim willing to betray everything she valued in exchange for temporary relief from suffering that her captors could inflict or withhold according to their assessment of her usefulness as source of information or leverage against her allies. The rescue mission that brought Sokka to the most heavily guarded prison in the Fire Nation was motivated by strategic considerations about weakening enemy capabilities and recovering valuable allies, but his personal investment in ensuring Suki's safety went far beyond tactical calculations to encompass emotional needs that he had not fully understood until faced with the possibility that she might be lost forever to forces that recognized no limits in their pursuit of total domination. The coordination they displayed during their escape from the prison demonstrated how thoroughly their individual skills had developed during their separation. Sokka's strategic planning, complemented by Suki's combat expertise, while both drew upon reserves of courage and determination that had been strengthened by their previous experiences of overcoming challenges that had seemed impossible when first encountered. The battles they fought side by side during the final campaign against the Fire Nation revealed the depth of trust they had developed in each other's abilities and judgment, each able to take risks that would have been foolhardy alone, but became calculated advantages when supported by a partner whose strengths compensated for their weaknesses, while their combined capabilities exceeded what either could have accomplished independently. The quiet moments they stole between military operations provided opportunities for conversation and connection that war's urgency made precious beyond ordinary measure, their growing understanding of each other's hopes and fears, creating intimacy that was deepened rather than threatened by the knowledge that any moment together might be their last. If the war's outcome did not favor their cause, Suki's acceptance of Sokka's protectiveness without allowing it to diminish her own agency or capability demonstrated the kind of mature partnership that honored both individuals' needs for security and autonomy. Her recognition that his desire to keep her safe emerged from love rather than lack of confidence in her abilities, while his understanding that her strength was asset rather than threat to his masculinity created balance that served both their growth. The physical affection they shared carried emotional weight that went far beyond simple attraction or temporary pleasure, their kisses and embraces serving as communication of feelings that words could not adequately express, promises that transcended the uncertainty of wartime to affirm their commitment to whatever future they might be able to build together if they survived the challenges that lay ahead. When the comet finally passed and Fire Lord Ozai's defeat ended the century of war that had shaped both their lives, the celebration of victory was accompanied by private recognition that they had found in each other something worth fighting for, that went beyond abstract principles or political objectives, a personal happiness that gave meaning to all the sacrifices they had made and witnessed during their long struggle against forces that sought to reduce human beings to mere instruments of power. The post-war period brought different challenges as they worked together to help rebuild a world that had been scarred by decades of conflict and mistrust, their partnership providing model for the kind of cooperation between different communities and traditions that would be necessary if peace were to become more than mere absence of active warfare, but genuine foundation for prosperity, mutual understanding. Suki's leadership of the Kyoshi warriors evolved to encompass not just protection of their island homeland, but participation in broader efforts to maintain stability and prevent the kind of extremism that could threaten the fragile peace that had been purchased with so much blood and sacrifice. Her expanded responsibilities, requiring skills that went beyond combat to include diplomacy and administration that drew upon different aspects of her intelligence and character. Sokka's contributions to the New World Order reflected his strategic abilities and his hard-won understanding of how different cultures and perspectives could complement each other when united by shared commitment to justice and mutual respect, rather than divided by competition for dominance or resources that could be managed cooperatively for everyone's benefit, rather than hoarded by those with sufficient power to take what they wanted. The relationship they built together during these years of reconstruction was characterized by equality and mutual support that allowed both to pursue their individual callings while maintaining the emotional connection and practical partnership that enriched rather than constrained their separate growth. Their love serving as foundation for contributions to the wider world that neither could have made alone. The legacy they created together extended far beyond their personal happiness to encompass the example they provided for others seeking to build relationships based on respect rather than domination, cooperation rather than competition, and the kind of mature love that enhanced rather than diminished the individuals who chose to share their lives in service of purposes greater than their immediate desires or temporary pleasures. The iceberg that held Aang in crystalline suspension for a century had been drifting through polar waters when Katara's desperate attempt to catch a fish with her untrained waterbending created the resonance that would shatter his frozen prison and change the course of history forever. But in that first moment, when the Avatar's eyes opened to meet hers through swirling mist and blinding light, neither understood that they were witnessing the beginning of a love story that would span lifetimes and reshape the spiritual foundations of their world. Katara's first impression of the strange boy who emerged from impossible circumstances was colored by wonder and protective instinct that seemed to arise from depths of her character she had not previously explored, her immediate concern for his well-being overriding the rational fear that anyone else might have felt when confronted with phenomena that challenged every assumption about what was possible in a world already strained by war, supernatural forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Aang's awakening consciousness was flooded with sensations and emotions that a century of spiritual suspension had not prepared him to process. But through the confusion and disorientation that accompanied his return to waking life, one clear perception emerged with startling intensity. The face of a girl whose eyes held depths of compassion that seemed to offer anchor in a reality that no longer contained anything familiar or comprehensible from his previous existence. The immediate practical concerns of survival in the harsh polar environment where they found themselves prevented, either from fully processing the significance of their first encounter, but even as Sokka's skepticism and Katara's questions revealed how completely the world had changed during Aang's absence. Subtle currents of connection were already beginning to flow between the young Avatar and the waterbender whose power had freed him from his crystalline prison, without either understanding the cosmic forces that had brought them together. Katara's instinctive protectiveness toward Aang reflected not just her natural compassion but recognition of vulnerability in someone whose apparent age masked the weight of responsibilities that would have crushed most adults. Her maternal instincts, awakened by his obvious need for guidance and support in navigating a world that bore no resemblance to the peaceful civilization he remembered from his childhood among the air nomads. The penguin sledding expedition that followed their escape from Prince Zuko's initial capture attempt provided their first opportunity to experience pure joy together without the immediate pressure of survival or the looming weight of Avatar responsibilities. Their shared laughter, echoing across ice fields that had not heard such sounds of innocent happiness since before the war began its systematic destruction of everything beautiful and spontaneous in the world. Aang's delight in sharing this simple pleasure with someone who could appreciate its wonder without the burden of cosmic significance or political implications revealed aspects of his personality that the Avatar identity threatened to overshadow. His essential nature as a playful child who found joy in small adventures and shared discoveries that connected him to others through experiences that transcended the isolation that came with being the last of his kind. Katara's willing participation in activities that her practical upbringing had taught her to consider frivolous demonstrated trust in Aang's judgment and willingness to embrace the kind of spontaneous happiness that had been scarce in her life since her mother's death. Her laughter during their improvised games, creating moments of lightness that both desperately needed amid the growing darkness of their larger mission. The gradual revelation of Aang's true identity as the Avatar created complex dynamics in their developing relationship, as Katara's initial protectiveness was complicated by recognition that the boy she had come to care about was also the cosmic figure upon whom the world's hope for peace depended, his individual needs potentially conflicting with the greater good that his Avatar role was meant to serve. The shared grief that bonded them during Aang's discovery of his people's genocide created spiritual connection that went beyond typical friendship or romantic attraction. Their mutual understanding of loss and abandonment, providing foundation for intimacy that could only exist between souls who had experienced similar devastation while maintaining their capacity for hope and compassion, despite evidence that the world could be cruel beyond comprehension. Katara's role in helping Aang process his rage and despair during these moments of overwhelming grief required emotional strength and wisdom that belied her chronological age. Her ability to remain calm and supportive while he struggled with feelings that threatened to consume his identity demonstrated maturity that had been forged through her own experiences of trauma and premature responsibility for others' welfare. The Cave of Two Lovers provided symbolic backdrop for their growing awareness that their connection transcended simple friendship, the ancient love story of Omer and Shu reflecting their own situation as people from different backgrounds who had found in each other something worth preserving, despite the forces arrayed against them and the uncertainty of whether they would survive long enough to explore the full potential of their bond. The darkness that trapped them in the underground tunnels created circumstances that stripped away distractions and social expectations, leaving them alone together with only their trust in each other and their willingness to be vulnerable in ways that daylight and the presence of others made more difficult. Their first kiss emerging naturally from the intimacy that had been building between them since the moment they met. Yet even as their romantic connection deepened, the complexities of their situation created tensions that tested the foundation they were building together. Aang's avatar responsibilities often requiring decisions and actions that his personal feelings about Katara's safety and happiness would have led him to avoid, while her growing understanding of his cosmic role made her increasingly willing to sacrifice her individual desires for the greater good he was meant to serve. The invasion of Ba Sing Se revealed how thoroughly external pressures could complicate their relationship, as political necessities and military strategies created situations where their personal bond became potential weakness that enemies could exploit. Their care for each other, making both vulnerable to manipulation by those who understood that love could become liability when stakes extended far beyond individual happiness or even survival. Katara's fury when she discovered that Aang had been keeping secrets about the approaching invasion reflected not just hurt feelings, but deeper fear that the boy she loved was being consumed by responsibilities that would eventually eliminate the individual person she cared about, leaving only the avatar identity that belonged to the world rather than to her or to himself. The complexity of loving someone whose destiny was not entirely his own created ongoing challenges that neither fully understood how to navigate. Their individual growth as people complicated by the reality that Aang's personal development was inseparable from his evolution as the Avatar, while Katara's own journey toward mastery of her abilities was shaped by her determination to support him without losing herself in the process. The Ember Island players' crude portrayal of their relationship forced them to confront questions about the nature and future of their romantic connection that the urgency of wartime had allowed them to postpone. Their public discussion of feelings that had remained largely private, revealing disagreements about timing and priorities that reflected their different approaches to balancing personal desires with larger responsibilities. Aang's impulsive kiss following Katara's expressed confusion about their relationship demonstrated the immaturity that his avatar role could not entirely overcome, his inability to respect her stated need for time and space, to process her own feelings, revealing how much he still had to learn about love as partnership rather than possession or fulfillment of his individual desires. The pain that both experienced as a result of this miscommunication illustrated how even genuine affection could create hurt when not tempered by wisdom and consideration for the other person's autonomy and emotional needs. Their temporary estrangement, serving as learning experience about the difference between wanting someone and truly loving them in ways that honored their separate identity and independent will. The final battle against Fire Lord Ozai created circumstances that forced both to confront the possibility that their love story might end before it had been fully explored. The knowledge that Aang might not survive his confrontation with forces that had already claimed so many lives, adding urgency to feelings that had been developing gradually over many months of shared danger and mutual support. Katara's presence during Aang's recovery from the injuries he sustained in that final battle provided opportunity for quiet intimacy that the chaos of wartime had rarely permitted. Their conversations during his healing process, allowing both to process not just physical trauma, but emotional wounds that combat and loss had inflicted upon their developing relationship. The peace that followed Ozai's defeat created new possibilities for their romantic connection while also presenting different challenges, as the transition from wartime urgency to peacetime uncertainty required them to discover what their relationship might become when no longer defined primarily by shared mission and constant danger. Their eventual marriage represented not just personal happiness but symbolic union between air nomad and water tribe cultures that embodied the broader healing and integration that the post-war world desperately needed. Their partnership serving as model for the kind of cooperation between different traditions that would be necessary if the peace they had fought to achieve was to become permanent foundation rather than temporary respite. The establishment of their family on Air Temple Island created sanctuary where air nomad traditions could be preserved and transmitted while remaining connected to the wider world that had been transformed by their efforts, their children representing hope that the wisdom of the past could inform the challenges of the future without being limited by assumptions that circumstances might render obsolete. The balancing act required to maintain their marriage while fulfilling Aang's ongoing responsibilities as Avatar and Katara's own calling as healer and advocate for justice demonstrated the kind of mature partnership that honored both individual growth and shared commitment, their love serving as foundation for contributions to the world that neither could have made alone while remaining source of personal fulfillment and emotional support. The challenges they faced in raising children who carried the legacy of multiple cultures while developing their own identities and abilities required wisdom that drew upon both their individual backgrounds and their shared experiences of navigating between different worlds and expectations. Their parenting reflecting lessons learned about the importance of honoring heritage while remaining open to evolution and change. The quiet moments they shared throughout their years together, morning meditations on the island's peaceful shores, evening conversations about their children's development and their own continuing growth, stolen afternoons when Avatar duties permitted simple enjoyment of each other's company, created the daily foundation that sustained them through more dramatic challenges and public responsibilities. The spiritual dimension of their bond deepened over time as both developed greater understanding of how individual relationships could serve larger purposes without being diminished by that service. Their love becoming expression of the harmony and balance that Aang's Avatar role was meant to promote throughout the world while remaining authentically personal and meaningful to them as individuals. The legacy of their relationship extended far beyond their personal happiness to encompass the example they provided for others seeking to build partnerships that honored both individual authenticity and shared commitment to purposes greater than immediate gratification. Their marriage, demonstrating how love could serve as bridge between different cultures while preserving the essential qualities that made each tradition valuable and worth maintaining. As Aang's life neared its end, the depth of connection they had built together provided comfort that transcended the pain of approaching separation. Their shared certainty that love continued beyond individual lifetimes, offering hope that their bond would endure in forms that death could not destroy, carrying forward into future incarnations the wisdom they had gained about how souls could support each other's growth across the eternal cycles of existence. The childhood friendship between Zuko and Mai had been built upon shared understanding of what it meant to grow up in Fire Nation nobility, where emotional expression was often viewed as weakness and personal desires were expected to yield to political necessity. Their early bond forged through recognition that they were both struggling with expectations that seemed designed to crush rather than cultivate the authentic aspects of their personalities that made them individuals rather than merely representatives of their prestigious family lines. Mai's attraction to Zuko had developed gradually during their youth, her naturally reserved temperament, making it difficult for others to recognize the depth of feeling that lay beneath her carefully maintained facade of indifference. Her apparent boredom with most social situations, masking intense observation and emotional investment that she had learned to hide as protection against disappointment and rejection in a culture that often punished vulnerability with cruelty or manipulation. The political upheaval that accompanied Fire Lord Azalon's death and Prince Ozai's ascension to the throne had separated them during crucial years of adolescent development, Zuko's banishment removing him from the Fire Nation court where Mai remained trapped in social circles that valued conformity over authenticity, her isolation deepening as she watched friends and acquaintances adapt to increasingly authoritarian expectations that left little room for individual conscience or personal loyalty. Their reunion in Ba Sing Se occurred under circumstances that neither could have predicted, the underground city's labyrinthine tunnels providing unexpected sanctuary where relationships could develop away from the surveillance and political pressures that made genuine intimacy dangerous or impossible within the Fire Nation's increasingly paranoid power structure, their rediscovered connection, offering both refuge from the loneliness that had marked their separation. Mai's decision to support Azula's conspiracy in Ba Sing Se reflected not political conviction but desperate desire to remain close to Zuko even if it meant participating in activities that violated her personal moral compass. Her willingness to compromise her principles, demonstrating how thoroughly love had disrupted her previous emotional detachment, while creating vulnerabilities that more ruthless individuals could exploit for their own purposes. The romantic relationship that bloomed between them during this period was characterized by intensity that surprised both participants, their shared history providing foundation for intimacy that could develop rapidly once circumstances permitted expression of feelings that had been suppressed for years. Their physical attraction complemented by emotional understanding that came from having witnessed each other's struggles with family expectations and social pressures. Yet, even as their connection deepened, the fundamental differences in their approaches to emotional expression created tensions that would continue to challenge their relationship throughout its duration. Zuko's passionate nature often overwhelming Mai's preference for subtle communication, while her emotional restraint sometimes left him feeling isolated and uncertain about her true feelings toward him and their shared future. The beach house episode that brought together the Fire Nation royal siblings and their companions created pressures that revealed underlying problems in how Zuko and Mai understood each other's needs and communication styles. Their conflict during the party, demonstrating how external expectations and internal insecurities could transform minor disagreements into relationship-threatening confrontations that damaged trust and emotional intimacy. Zuko's frustration with Mai's apparent lack of enthusiasm for activities that he hoped would bring them closer together reflected his incomplete understanding of her personality and the ways in which her emotional reserve served as protection against forces that had taught her to expect disappointment and betrayal from those she allowed herself to care about. His criticism of her behavior, revealing immaturity about the nature of authentic affection. Mai's defensive response to Zuko's accusations about her emotional availability demonstrated how thoroughly their different coping mechanisms for dealing with trauma and family dysfunction could create barriers to mutual understanding. Her inability to express vulnerability in the direct manner that Zuko preferred, leaving both partners feeling misunderstood and emotionally isolated despite their physical proximity and shared experiences. The reconciliation that followed their beach confrontation required both to acknowledge responsibility for patterns of behavior that had created unnecessary pain. Zuko's recognition that his expectations were unfair to Mai's authentic nature, balanced by her acknowledgement that her emotional withdrawal could be hurtful to someone who needed more direct reassurance about her feelings and commitment to their relationship. The period of relative stability that followed saw their partnership develop greater depth and mutual accommodation, both learning to work with rather than against their fundamental personality differences. Zuko's growing maturity, enabling him to appreciate Mai's subtle expressions of affection, while her increasing trust allowed for more direct communication about needs and concerns that affected their shared happiness. The crisis that ultimately tested their relationship beyond its capacity to endure arose from Zuko's spiritual awakening and his growing recognition that his participation in Fire Nation imperialism violated principles that he could no longer ignore in favor of personal comfort or family loyalty. His internal transformation, creating conflicts between his romantic relationship and his moral development that seemed to offer no satisfactory resolution. The scroll that Zuko left for Mai when he chose to join Team Avatar represented his attempt to protect her from the consequences of his betrayal, while acknowledging that their relationship could not continue under circumstances where his political choices would inevitably endanger her safety and potentially compromise her own moral position. His decision to end their romantic connection through written communication rather than direct conversation, reflecting both cowardice and genuine concern for her welfare. Mai's reaction to this abandonment revealed the depth of emotional investment that her reserved exterior had concealed, her anger and hurt at being excluded from a decision that fundamentally affected her future, demonstrating how thoroughly Zuko had misunderstood her capacity for loyalty and her willingness to accept risks in support of principles and people she valued above her own safety and social position. The confrontation at Boiling Rock that forced Mai to choose between her allegiance to Azula and her love for Zuko created circumstances where her true character was revealed through action rather than words. Her willingness to face imprisonment and possible execution rather than allow Zuko's capture, proving that her feelings ran far deeper than her emotional restraint had previously suggested. Her declaration that she loved Zuko more than she feared Azula represented not just romantic devotion, but fundamental choice about the kind of person she wanted to be. Her defiance of the princess's authority, marking transformation from passive observer of political events to active participant in moral decisions that would define her character and determine her future, regardless of immediate consequences. The imprisonment that followed her betrayal of Azula provided time for reflection about the relationship she had risked everything to preserve. Her separation from Zuko during this period, allowing both to consider whether their connection was strong enough to survive the political and personal changes that had transformed them both. Since their childhood friendship first evolved into romantic attachment, the reunion that followed Fire Lord Ozai's defeat and the war's end brought together two people who had been changed by experiences that had tested their individual characters in ways that their previous relationship had not prepared them to handle. Their renewed partnership, requiring renegotiation of expectations and boundaries that reflected their growth as individuals while honoring the foundation they had built together. Mai's warning to Zuko about never breaking up with her again was delivered with characteristic dry humor that masked serious communication about her expectations for how disagreements and major decisions would be handled in their renewed relationship. Her stipulation, reflecting lessons learned about the importance of direct communication and mutual consultation in partnerships that involved individuals with strong principles and independent judgment. The challenges they faced as Fire Lord and his partner required both to navigate public scrutiny and political pressures, while maintaining private intimacy and emotional connection, their relationship serving as symbol of Fire Nation transformation, while remaining authentic personal bond that provided support and companionship during the difficult work of national reconstruction and international reconciliation. The maturation of their partnership over time demonstrated how individuals with fundamentally different approaches to emotional expression could learn to complement rather than frustrate each other when both were committed to growth and mutual understanding, their love evolving from adolescent intensity to adult stability that could weather disagreements and external pressures without losing essential connection. The balance they eventually achieved between Zuko's need for emotional expression and Mai's preference for subtle communication created model for how couples could honor their individual temperaments while meeting each other's needs for affection and reassurance, their relationship showing that compatibility did not require similarity, but rather willingness to appreciate and accommodate differences that enriched rather than threatened their shared life. The legacy of their partnership extended beyond personal happiness to influence Fire Nation culture's gradual evolution, away from authoritarian rigidity toward greater acceptance of individual expression and emotional authenticity, their example demonstrating that strength could coexist with vulnerability, that leadership could incorporate compassion, and that love could survive even the most challenging political and personal transformations. Their story served as a reminder that authentic relationships required ongoing effort and mutual commitment to growth rather than static compatibility. Their willingness to work through fundamental differences in communication style and emotional expression, providing hope for others seeking to build partnerships that honored both individual authenticity and shared commitment to purposes greater than immediate personal satisfaction. The mountains that surrounded the village where Oma and Shu first encountered each other had been neutral ground for centuries, their peaks serving as natural boundary between the two clans, whose ancient rivalry had claimed countless lives without either side remembering the original cause of their enmity, the hatred passed down through generations like precious heirloom that no one dared question for fear of betraying ancestors whose sacrifices demanded continued vengeance against enemies whose own losses created equally compelling claims for justice. Oma belonged to the clan that dwelt on the eastern slopes where morning light first touched stone and encouraged the growth of terraced gardens that had been carved from mountainside through patient labor, spanning dozens of generations. Her people known throughout the region for their skill in cultivating crops that could flourish in rocky soil and harsh weather, their prosperity built upon intimate knowledge of Earth's moods, and the subtle negotiations required to coax sustenance from seemingly barren ground. Shu's people claimed the western faces where sunset painted cliffs in shades of fire that reminded observers of forge light and the metalworking traditions that had made his clan wealthy through trade with distant cities, their reputation for crafting tools and weapons that remained sharp through decades of use, balanced by stories of their fierce protection of family honor and their willingness to sacrifice individual happiness for collective security against those who would threaten their mountain strongholds. The first meeting between the young lovers occurred during one of the rare truces that allowed limited trade between the clans, their eyes finding each other across the neutral ground where merchants displayed goods while armed guards from both sides maintained watchful distance. The recognition that passed between them transcending the careful protocols that governed such encounters to touch something deeper than cultural conditioning or family loyalty. The conversations that began during subsequent trading sessions were conducted in whispers and stolen glances, their growing attraction complicated by awareness that discovery would mean death for both and potential renewal of warfare between peoples who had barely managed to establish temporary peace through negotiations that could be shattered by any incident that either side could interpret as betrayal or provocation. The secret meetings that followed these initial encounters required elaborate deception and careful timing, their rendezvous in hidden caves, and secluded valleys protected by geography that made observation difficult while providing escape routes. Should patrols from either clan discover their unauthorized contact across boundary lines that had been sealed with blood and defended with lives that their families considered well spent in service of ancient grudges, the love that developed between them during these clandestine meetings was intensified by the constant awareness of danger and the knowledge that each moment together might be their last. If circumstances or chance betrayed their secret too, authorities who would view their relationship as treason, deserving punishment that extended beyond individual execution to encompass potential collective retaliation against family members who might be held responsible for failing to prevent such scandalous violation of tribal law. The earthbending that emerged from their desperate need to create private spaces where their love could flourish without detection was born from emotional intensity rather than formal training, their combined will shaping stone and soil into chambers and tunnels that responded to feelings too powerful to be contained by conventional limitations, their abilities manifesting through partnership in ways that neither could have achieved through individual effort or traditional instruction. The labyrinth they created beneath the mountain became both sanctuary and symbol of their relationship. Its passages carved through bedrock by techniques that had never been documented or taught, each chamber reflecting some aspect of their shared dreams for future that seemed impossible given the hatred that surrounded them, their architectural collaboration demonstrating how love could literally reshape reality when supported by sufficient determination and creative vision. The war that eventually erupted between their clans was triggered not by discovery of their relationship, but by economic disputes and territorial conflicts that had been building pressure beneath the surface of their fragile peace. Yet the lovers knew that their secret would be viewed as additional betrayal if revealed during period when any contact with the enemy would be interpreted as espionage or collaboration, deserving the most severe punishment available to military justice. The battles that raged across the mountainsides where they had once walked together in freedom transformed familiar landscapes into scenes of devastation and death, their knowledge of hidden paths and secret places becoming tactical advantages that could benefit their respective peoples if shared. Their silence about geographic intelligence protecting not just their personal secret, but potentially saving lives that might be lost through military actions based on incomplete information. The final confrontation that brought their story to its tragic conclusion occurred when Shu fell in battle defending a position that his military knowledge suggested was indefensible, but his personal courage would not allow him to abandon. His death witnessed by Oma from across the valley, where her own clan's forces waited for orders that would send them into combat that could only result in mutual destruction. The grief that overwhelmed Oma upon witnessing her beloved's death was transformed into rage that drew upon earthbending abilities that had been developed through love but now served vengeance, her power channeling fury into geological forces that split mountains and redirected rivers. Her demonstration of what individual will could accomplish when unrestrained by moral considerations or concern for consequences, terrifying both armies into recognition that continued warfare would mean annihilation for everyone involved. The peace that emerged from this display of devastating power was negotiated not through diplomatic protocol, but through mutual fear of what might happen if the woman who could reshape continents decided that one side or the other deserved complete destruction, her threat to eliminate both clans unless they found ways to coexist, serving as foundation for agreements that transformed ancient enemies into cautious neighbors who shared territory rather than fighting over exclusive control. The legend that grew around Oma and Shu became foundation myth for earthbending traditions that emphasized love's power to overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable through conventional means. Their story taught to young earthbenders as demonstration of how emotional connection to others could unlock abilities that individual ambition or anger could never access. Their tragedy serving as warning about the costs of allowing hatred to poison possibilities for understanding and cooperation. Avatar Kyoshi's romantic entanglements reflected the complexity of someone whose responsibilities to the world often conflicted with her personal desires for intimate connection and emotional fulfillment. Her relationships with both Rangi and Yun revealing different aspects of her character, while illustrating how cosmic duties could complicate even the most genuine attempts to build authentic partnerships with individuals who understood and supported her mission, while maintaining their own identity and purpose. The bond between Kyoshi and Rangi grew from shared training and mutual respect into partnership that encompassed both professional collaboration and personal devotion. Their relationship demonstrating how love could enhance rather than distract from serious work when both individuals remained committed to purposes greater than their immediate happiness, while finding in each other support and understanding that made their individual contributions more effective than either could have achieved alone. The tragedy that surrounded Kyoshi's connection with Yun illustrated how Avatar responsibilities could transform even positive relationships into sources of pain and moral conflict. Her discovery of his corruption and the necessity of opposing someone she had once cared about, demonstrating the isolation that came with cosmic role that sometimes required sacrificing personal happiness for principles that served the greater good, even when such choices felt like betrayals of everything that made life worth living. The brief life and devastating loss that characterized Avatar Kuruk's relationship with Umi served as cautionary tale about how even the Avatar's great power could prove inadequate when confronted with forces that operated according to spiritual rather than physical laws. Their love story, becoming legend that taught future generations about the importance of maintaining balance between material world responsibilities and spiritual realm obligations that could demand ultimate sacrifice from those who served as bridges between dimensions of existence. The friendship between Avatar Roku and Fire Lord Sozin that evolved into something deeper and more complex than simple political alliance represented one of history's great might-have-beens, their personal connection providing foundation that could have prevented the century of war that followed their eventual estrangement. Their inability to navigate the tension between individual affection and conflicting visions of national duty, serving as tragic example of how personal relationships could become casualties of larger historical forces. The eternal dance between Tui and La, the moon and ocean spirits whose cosmic partnership had sustained the world's natural cycles since the beginning of time, offered model for how love could operate on scales that transcended individual lifetimes and personal concerns, their relationship demonstrating how complementary forces could maintain balance through ongoing interaction that honored both opposition and cooperation as necessary elements of cosmic harmony. The dragon partnerships that sustained Sun Warrior civilization for millennia before their retreat from human contact illustrated how love could exist between beings whose consciousness operated according to principles that mortal minds could barely comprehend, their mating bonds creating not just offspring but spiritual connections that influenced the development of firebending and the understanding of flame as life force rather than merely destructive energy. The air nomad poetry that preserved memory of legendary lovers who had transcended individual existence to become eternal spirits, watching over temple grounds and mountain peaks, spoke of relationships that had achieved spiritual transformation through perfect balance of detachment and compassion. Their stories inspiring generations of young monks and nuns to seek partnerships that served enlightenment rather than merely satisfying temporary desires for companionship and physical pleasure. The Water Tribe star maps that recorded positions of celestial bodies named after famous lovers whose relationships had influenced tribal history and cultural development showed how romantic partnerships could become part of navigation, systems that guided travelers across vast distances, their legends providing both practical knowledge and spiritual inspiration for those who sought direction in uncertain circumstances. The Earth Kingdom folklore that identified specific rock formations and geographical features, with couples whose love had been so powerful that it literally shaped the landscape, created connections between human emotion and natural phenomena that reminded each generation of the potential for individual relationships to influence environments and communities in ways that extended far beyond immediate participants. The Fire Nation historical records that had been carefully edited to remove references to relationships that contradicted official ideology nevertheless preserved traces of love stories that had influenced political development, cultural evolution, their fragmentary survival, suggesting that authentic human connection was too powerful to be completely erased by authorities who found such examples threatening to their attempts to control individual behavior and social organization. These ancient tales of love that had transcended ordinary limitations continued to influence contemporary understanding of what relationships could achieve when supported by spiritual wisdom and commitment to growth that honored both individual authenticity and shared purpose, their lessons remaining relevant across centuries and cultural changes because they addressed universal human needs for connection, understanding, and the kind of partnership that enhanced, rather than diminished, each person's capacity to contribute meaningfully to the world's healing and transformation. The arranged marriage between Ursa and Prince Ozai represented everything that was corrupt and spiritually bankrupt about Fire Nation nobility during the years leading up to the war, their union serving political purposes that had nothing to do with personal compatibility or mutual affection, while creating the kind of emotional wasteland that would eventually produce children whose psychological damage would ripple through generations and influence the fate of entire nations through decisions made by individuals who had never experienced authentic love or healthy family relationships. Ursa's sacrifice of her own happiness and freedom to protect her former lover Ikem and their daughter Kiyi demonstrated the impossible choices that political marriages forced upon women who possessed compassion and moral clarity in Fomen WWO, systems designed to reward ruthlessness and punish vulnerability, her willingness to accept exile from everything she valued most, in order to prevent harm to innocent people, revealing character that transcended the limitations of her circumstances, while highlighting the tragedy of potential that would never be fully realized. The loveless atmosphere that pervaded the royal palace during Azalon's reign had created an environment where children grew up understanding power as the only currency that mattered in human relationships, their emotional development stunted by exposure to adults whose own capacity for authentic connection had been destroyed by political pressures and competitive dynamics that made trust dangerous and vulnerability potentially fatal to career advancement or physical survival. Prince Ozai's relationship with Ursa was characterized by possessiveness rather than affection, his treatment of her reflecting his understanding of marriage as ownership rather than partnership, his inability to recognize her as an independent person, with her own thoughts and feelings, demonstrating psychological damage that made him incapable of the kind of emotional intimacy that healthy relationships required for mutual growth and genuine happiness. The children who emerged from this toxic environment carried wounds that would influence their entire approach to relationships and emotional expression. Zuko's desperate need for approval and validation, reflecting his father's conditional regard, while Azula's manipulative cruelty demonstrated what happened when natural intelligence was shaped by witnessing power dynamics that treated other people as objects to be used rather than fellow conscious beings deserving of respect and consideration. Ursa's attempts to provide some emotional warmth and moral guidance within this hostile environment were constantly undermined by political necessities and her husband's jealousy of any influence that might compete with his absolute authority over family members, whom he viewed as extensions of his own will rather than individuals with legitimate needs for love, security, and the kind of guidance that would enable them to develop into psychologically healthy adults. The pressure that royal status placed upon every aspect of personal relationship extended beyond immediate family to encompass the broader network of nobles, advisors, and servants whose lives were shaped by proximity to power that demanded constant vigilance and careful management of emotional expression that might be interpreted as weakness or disloyalty by those who held authority over life and death decisions. Fire Lord Azulon's own marriage had been arranged to consolidate political alliances and produce heirs who could continue the royal bloodline. His relationship with his wife existing primarily as state function rather than source of personal fulfillment or emotional support, their interactions governed by protocol and ceremony that left little room for the kind of spontaneous affection and mutual care that characterized healthy partnerships in less politically charged environments. The isolation that came with absolute power made authentic relationships nearly impossible for those who occupied the highest positions in Fire Nation hierarchy. Their every interaction filtered through calculations about strategic advantage and potential threats. Their ability to trust others, compromised by knowledge that many people around them were motivated primarily by desire to gain favor or avoid punishment, rather than genuine concern for their welfare or happiness as individual human beings. Earth King Kuei's complete disconnection from the reality of his kingdom and his people reflected the dangers of hereditary leadership that placed individuals in positions of tremendous responsibility without providing them with experiences or relationships necessary to understand the human consequences of their decisions. His isolation within the palace walls, creating psychological environment that made meaningful connection with others nearly impossible to achieve or sustain. The elaborate protocols and ceremonial requirements that surrounded royal courtship and marriage in Earth Kingdom tradition were designed to ensure political stability and economic advantages, rather than personal compatibility or emotional fulfillment. Their emphasis on family lineage and social status, creating barriers to authentic connection while reinforcing class distinctions that served existing power structures more effectively than they promoted individual happiness or social harmony. Chief Hakoda's relationship with his wife Kia represented exception to the pattern of political marriage that characterized most leadership families, their genuine love and mutual respect, creating household atmosphere that nurtured their children's emotional development, while providing model for healthy partnership that emphasized cooperation and shared responsibility, rather than dominance and submission dynamics that poisoned so many relationships between people of different social ranks or political positions. The tragedy of Kia's death during Fire Nation raids eliminated not just beloved wife and mother, but also the stabilizing influence that authentic love had provided within their community. her loss creating emotional vacuum that could not be filled by political alliances or military victories, her memory serving as reminder of what was being defended and what had already been lost to forces that seemed determined to destroy everything beautiful and nurturing in the world. The burden of leadership during wartime created additional pressures on romantic relationships, as political decisions carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate family to encompass entire populations whose survival might depend upon choices that individual happiness would argue against. The tension between personal desires and collective welfare, creating moral dilemmas that tested every assumption about duty, sacrifice, and the relative importance of individual fulfillment versus community survival. The next generation of leaders who emerged from this environment of political pressure and personal sacrifice carried both wisdom gained through witnessing the costs of power and psychological wounds that influenced their own approach to relationships and emotional expression. Their experiences teaching them about the importance of maintaining connections that transcended political calculation, while also revealing how difficult such authenticity could be to achieve and preserve under circumstances that demanded constant vigilance. Fire Lord Zuko struggles to balance his personal relationships with his responsibilities, as ruler reflected broader questions about whether individuals who wielded great power could maintain the kind of emotional vulnerability and authentic connection that healthy partnerships required. His efforts to govern justly while preserving his capacity for love and trust, demonstrating both the possibility and the difficulty of integrating personal fulfillment with public service that served the greater good. The institutional changes that post-war leaders attempted to implement were designed to create systems that could support both effective governance and healthy human development. Their recognition that political structures needed to accommodate rather than suppress authentic emotional expression, reflecting lessons learned about the connection between individual psychological health and collective social stability. Princess Yue's acceptance of her cosmic destiny despite her personal longing for ordinary life and romantic love represented ultimate example of duty triumphing over individual desire, her transformation into the moon spirit, serving purposes that extended far beyond her personal happiness, while illustrating both the nobility and the tragedy of sacrifice that cosmic responsibilities sometimes demanded from those who had not chosen their roles but accepted them nevertheless. The ripple effects of royal dysfunction extended throughout society, as nobles and commoners alike modeled their own relationships on patterns established by leadership families. The normalization of emotional distance and strategic thinking in personal matters, creating cultural atmosphere that made authentic intimacy suspect and vulnerability dangerous, even in relationships that possessed no political significance or public visibility. The healing that became possible after the war's end required not just political reconciliation, but psychological recovery from patterns of thinking and relating that had been necessary for survival during conflict but became obstacles to genuine peace and prosperity when circumstances changed, to allow for different approaches to power, responsibility, and the integration of individual needs with collective welfare. The young leaders who inherited responsibility for rebuilding their world carried both hope for different kinds of relationships and awareness of how easily power could corrupt even well-intentioned individuals. Their determination to maintain their humanity while serving larger purposes, representing ongoing experiment in whether political leadership and authentic love could coexist within single life without destroying either the individual, the institutions they were meant to serve. The legacy of royal romance and its failures served as cautionary tale for future generations, while also providing inspiration for those who sought to prove that power and love were not inherently incompatible when approached with comply, wisdom, humility, and commitment to values that honored both individual authenticity and collective responsibility for creating conditions where all people could flourish, rather than merely survive the exercises of authority that shaped their daily lives and long-term possibilities. The rivalry that initially defined the relationship between Korra and Asami was born from circumstances that neither had chosen, but both felt compelled to navigate with grace and dignity that reflected their individual characters. Their competition for Mako's romantic attention, creating tension that masked deeper similarities in their approaches to life, their shared values about justice and personal integrity, and their mutual capacity for loyalty that would eventually transcend the superficial conflicts that had first brought them into each other's orbit as adversaries rather than potential allies. Korra's initial impression of Asami was colored by assumptions about wealthy non-benders that reflected her own insecurities about fitting into Republic City's complex social hierarchies. Her background as the Avatar from the Southern Water Tribe, creating feelings of inadequacy when confronted with someone who seemed to possess effortless sophistication and cultural knowledge that formal Avatar training had never addressed. Her defensive reactions to Asami's apparent advantages, revealing vulnerabilities that she preferred to hide behind displays of bending prowess and stubborn determination. Asami's perspective on their early encounters was complicated by her genuine attraction to Mako and her desire to build authentic relationships that transcended her father's wealth and social position, her awareness that many people approached her with ulterior motives, making Korra's obvious dislike refreshing in its honesty, even as it created obstacles to friendship that might otherwise have developed naturally between two strong-willed young women who shared more common ground than their surface differences suggested. The revelation of Hiroshi Sato's involvement with the Equalist movement created crisis that forced both young women to reconsider their assumptions about each other's character and motivations. Asami's decision to betray her father rather than support his extremist agenda, demonstrating moral courage that impressed Korra while revealing depths of principle that wealth and privilege had not corrupted. Her willingness to sacrifice family loyalty for justice, earning respect that transcended their previous romantic rivalry. The shared experiences of fighting alongside each other during the Equalist crisis began to break down barriers that competition and misunderstanding had created, their individual strengths complementing each other in ways that made their partnership more effective than either could have achieved alone. Korra's bending abilities, balanced by Asami's technological expertise, while both drew upon reserves of courage and determination that dangerous circumstances revealed and refined through testing that proved their character under pressure. The gradual evolution from rivalry to friendship occurred through countless small moments of mutual support and understanding that accumulated over time to create foundation of trust and respect that could survive disagreements and challenges. Their growing appreciation for each other's unique perspective and abilities, creating bond that transcended their initial romantic competition to encompass genuine care for each other's welfare and happiness that had nothing to do with external validation or strategic advantage. The second season's challenges tested their developing friendship while revealing how thoroughly their relationship had changed from its competitive origins. Their collaboration during the Water Tribe's civil war and subsequent Spirit World crisis, demonstrating partnership built on equality and mutual reliance, rather than the kind of superficial alliance that convenience might create between people who shared common enemies but lacked deeper connection or authentic understanding. Asami's unwavering support during Korra's recovery from her poisoning at the hands of the Red Lotus represented a turning point in their relationship, her patient care and emotional presence providing exactly the kind of non-judgmental companionship that healing required. Her willingness to remain present during Korra's darkest moments, without trying to fix or change, her revealing depth of compassion that went beyond ordinary friendship to encompass something approaching unconditional love. The letters that Asami received during Korra's 3-year absence were remarkable not just for their frequency, but for their emotional honesty and intimacy. Korra's written communications revealing thoughts and feelings that she had difficulty expressing in person, her trust in Asami's discretion and understanding creating space for vulnerability that formal avatar responsibilities rarely permitted in her interactions with political leaders and spiritual advisors who viewed her primarily as symbol rather than individual person. The spiritual journey they undertook together in the spirit world provided an environment where their relationship could develop without external pressures or social expectations. Their shared exploration of realms beyond ordinary reality, creating intimacy that physical proximity alone could never have achieved. Their mutual wonder at spiritual mysteries they encountered together, forging connection that transcended typical categories of friendship or romance to encompass something unique and precious. The gradual recognition of romantic feelings between them occurred through subtle shifts in attention and care rather than dramatic revelations or passionate declarations. Their growing awareness of each other as potential romantic partners emerging naturally from foundation of friendship and mutual respect that had been building over years of shared experiences, their transition from friends to lovers feeling inevitable rather than surprising to observers who had witnessed their deepening connection. The courage required to acknowledge feelings that defied social conventions and personal expectations reflected both women's commitment to authenticity over conformity, their willingness to risk misunderstanding and potential rejection in pursuit of genuine connection, demonstrating maturity and self-awareness that enabled them to transcend limitations that less confident individuals might have, accepted as insurmountable barriers to happiness and personal fulfillment. The support they provided each other during the final confrontation with Kuvira and the challenges of rebuilding Republic City showed how thoroughly their partnership had integrated personal affection with shared commitment to justice and social progress, their love serving to enhance, rather than distract from their individual contributions to causes larger than their immediate happiness, while providing emotional foundation that enabled both to take risks and make sacrifices that isolated individuals might have found too difficult to sustain. The symbolic significance of their relationship extended far beyond personal happiness to represent evolution in social attitudes toward love and partnership that had been constrained by traditional assumptions about gender roles and acceptable forms of romantic expression, their example opening possibilities for others who had felt forced to choose between authentic relationships and social acceptance, their courage creating space for greater diversity in how people understood and celebrated love. The quiet intimacy they shared during peaceful moments between larger adventures and responsibilities revealed relationship built on genuine compatibility and mutual enjoyment rather than dramatic passion or external validation, their contentment in each other's company, creating stability that could weather challenges and changes while providing foundation for individual growth that honored both their shared connection and their separate identities and aspirations. The integration of their professional lives and personal relationship demonstrated how love could enhance rather than compete with serious work when both individuals remained committed to purposes beyond their immediate satisfaction. Their collaboration on technological projects and social reform initiatives, showing how romantic partnership could serve broader goals while providing personal fulfillment that made their individual contributions more sustainable and effective over time. The conversations they shared about their hopes for the future reflected mutual understanding of how their relationship fit into larger patterns of social change and spiritual evolution. Their recognition that their love story was part of broader transformation in how people understood identity, connection, and the possibilities for authentic relationships that honored both individual authenticity and collective responsibility for creating more inclusive and compassionate communities. The spiritual dimensions of their bond were evident in moments when their connection seemed to transcend ordinary consciousness. Their meditation practices and shared exploration of philosophical questions creating intimacy that engaged not just emotional and physical aspects of their relationship, but deeper layers of identity and purpose that connected them to cosmic forces that guided all genuine love towards service of harmony and balance in the world. The legacy of their partnership would influence future generations, not just through their individual accomplishments, but through their demonstration that love could take many forms while maintaining essential qualities of respect, support, and mutual dedication to each other's growth and happiness. Their relationship serving as reminder that authentic connection was possible regardless of social categories or conventional expectations, when approached with courage, wisdom, and commitment to truth rather than appearance. The revolution of consciousness that their love represented was quiet but profound, changing assumptions about what relationships could be and who deserved recognition and celebration for choosing authentic partnership over conventional safety. Their example inspiring others to examine their own assumptions about love, while providing hope that society could evolve to embrace diversity in human connection as strength rather than threat to existing institutions and traditional values that remained worth preserving when they served genuine human flourishing rather than mere conformity to external expectations. The brief but intense connection that developed between Jet and Katara was built upon shared experiences of loss and displacement that created immediate understanding between two young people who had witnessed the destruction of everything they held dear. Their mutual recognition of pain that went beyond ordinary teenage heartbreak or family dysfunction to encompass the kind of trauma that war inflicted upon children who were forced to grow up too quickly in a world where innocence had become luxury that few could afford to maintain. Katara's attraction to Jet reflected not just his obvious charisma and leadership abilities, but her deep longing to find someone who understood the rage and grief that consumed her thoughts during quiet moments when she allowed herself to remember her mother's death and the helplessness she had felt as a child watching Fire Nation soldiers destroy everything that had given her life meaning and security before she developed the strength and skills necessary to fight back against forces that seemed determined to eliminate everyone she loved. The tea shop encounter that brought them together occurred during a period when both were struggling with questions about identity and purpose. That peaceful circumstances might have allowed them to explore gradually through normal processes of adolescent development, but which war's urgency demanded they resolve quickly enough to serve larger causes that required commitment and clarity about values that would guide their actions when faced with choices between personal desires and collective responsibilities. Jet's presentation of himself as freedom fighter, dedicated to protecting innocent people from Fire Nation oppression, masked psychological damage that had transformed justified anger into indiscriminate hatred. His inability to distinguish between enemy soldiers and civilian refugees from the same nation, revealing how thoroughly trauma could corrupt moral judgment and turn legitimate resistance into the kind of extremism that ultimately served oppression by discrediting the very causes it claimed to champion. The romantic connection that began to develop between them during their brief time together in Ba Sing Se represented possibility for healing that both desperately needed, but which circumstances would prevent from reaching its full potential, their mutual attraction offering hope that shared understanding of loss could become foundation for building something beautiful and life-affirming, rather than merely sustaining cycles of vengeance that consumed everything they touched. Katara's growing unease with Jet's methods and his willingness to endanger innocent lives in pursuit of his mission against the Fire Nation created moral crisis that tested her ability to separate her feelings about him as individual from her judgment about his actions and their consequences. Her recognition that love could not excuse or transform behavior that violated her fundamental principles about protecting the innocent representing crucial moment in her own moral development. The tragedy of their relationship lay not in external obstacles or political pressures, but in Jet's inability to transcend the psychological wounds that had shaped his approach to justice and resistance, his descent into extremism that made him dangerous to the very people he claimed to protect, demonstrating how trauma could destroy the capacity for the kind of nuanced thinking that effective leadership required in complex moral situations, where simple categories of good and evil proved inadequate. The final confrontation that ended their potential romance occurred when Katara was forced to choose between loyalty to someone she cared about and commitment to principles that defined her character. Her decision to oppose Jet's plan to flood the underground city, demonstrating moral courage that transcended personal feelings to serve larger purposes, even when such choices caused immediate pain and disappointment that she would carry long after their relationship ended. The impossibility of romance between Sokka and Princess Yue was established from the moment they met, their mutual attraction occurring within context of cosmic responsibilities that would eventually require sacrifice of individual happiness for spiritual purposes that neither fully understood until circumstances forced them to confront the reality that some destinies could not be avoided or negotiated through human will or desire, no matter how genuine or powerful such feelings might be. Their first encounter during the festival celebrations in the Northern Water Tribe created immediate connection that transcended cultural differences and social boundaries. Their shared laughter and easy conversation, suggesting compatibility that might have developed into lasting partnership under different circumstances, their delight in each other's company providing brief respite from the pressures and responsibilities that shaped their daily lives as war approached their peaceful stronghold. The betrothal that bound Yue to Han represented political necessity rather than personal choice, her acceptance of arranged marriage reflecting duty to her people and understanding that individual desires needed to yield to collective welfare during times of crisis, her resignation to loveless partnership, demonstrating maturity and selflessness that made her personal sacrifice all the more poignant when contrasted with the happiness she might have found with someone who valued her for herself rather than her political utility. The stolen moments they shared during the festival and in the days that followed were marked by awareness that their time together was limited not just by social conventions but by cosmic forces that were preparing to claim Yue for purposes that transcended ordinary human relationships, their conversations carrying undertones of sadness that reflected their mutual recognition that their connection could never develop beyond friendship, despite feelings that suggested greater possibilities. The spiritual crisis that accompanied the moon spirit's destruction forced Yue to confront destiny that she had always known awaited her, her choice to sacrifice her mortal existence to restore cosmic balance, demonstrating courage that went beyond personal heroism to encompass spiritual transformation that would enable her to serve universal harmony rather than individual happiness. Her final kiss with Sokka, representing both farewell and promise that love could transcend physical limitations. The grief that Sokka experienced following Yue's transformation into the moon spirit was complicated by recognition that her sacrifice had saved not just the Northern Water Tribe but the entire world's spiritual balance, his personal loss becoming part of a larger story about duty and sacrifice that gave meaning to suffering, while providing no comfort for the loneliness that followed the death of dreams that had barely begun to take shape before. Circumstances eliminated their possibility. Uncle Iroh's references to lost love remained tantalizingly incomplete throughout his appearances in the series. His occasional comments about someone who had meant everything to him before war and politics had destroyed their relationship, creating background of personal tragedy that helped explain his wisdom about the costs of conflict and his Bisya determination to help others avoid making the same mistakes that had cost him his greatest happiness and left him with only memories and regrets. The war that separated lovers across national boundaries created countless stories of romance interrupted by political loyalties and military necessities, their individual tragedies representing broader pattern of how conflict destroyed not just lives, but possibilities for connection and understanding that might have created bridges between cultures if circumstances had permitted personal relationships to develop without interference from forces that viewed love as weakness or distraction from military objectives. The Fire Nation's citizens who fell in love with Earth Kingdom refugees faced impossible choices between family loyalty and romantic commitment, their relationships requiring secrecy that added stress and danger to connections that were already challenging due to cultural differences, and the trauma that displacement had inflicted upon people who had lost everything except their lives, and whatever hope they could maintain for eventual return to homes that might no longer exist. The Earth Kingdom soldiers who developed feelings for Fire Nation prisoners found themselves torn between duty to their nation and recognition of shared humanity with individuals who had been designated as enemies, their forbidden romances representing triumph of personal connection over political propaganda, while also creating potential for accusations of treason that could result in execution for both partners if their relationships were discovered by authorities. Love that bloomed in prison camps and refugee settlements was often intensified by shared suffering and mutual dependence for survival, the extreme circumstances creating bonds that might not have developed under ordinary conditions, while testing relationships through hardships that revealed character and commitment in ways that peaceful courtship could never duplicate. Their partnerships forged through adversity that eliminated superficial considerations in favor of essential compatibility. The couples who chose love over national loyalty often paid prices that extended beyond personal consequences to encompass family rejection and social ostracism that could last for generations, their children growing up as outsiders in communities that viewed mixed heritage as evidence of betrayal rather than bridge between cultures, their sacrifice serving causes larger than their immediate happiness, while creating new forms of suffering that peacetime would need to address through reconciliation and healing. The poetry and songs that preserved memory of these star-crossed lovers served dual purposes of honoring their courage and warning future generations about the costs of allowing political hatred to poison personal relationships. their stories becoming part of cultural heritage that celebrated love's power while acknowledging its limitations. When confronted with forces that operated according to principles that transcended individual desires or even collective welfare in service of abstract ideologies that reduced human beings to symbols rather than recognizing them as conscious entities deserving of happiness and respect. The relationship between Toph and her parents represented one of the most complex examples of how genuine love could become destructive when filtered through fear and misunderstanding. Their desperate desire to protect their daughter from a world they perceived as hostile and dangerous, leading them to create the very prison that their protective instincts were meant to prevent. Their inability to see beyond her blindness, to recognize her extraordinary capabilities, demonstrating how even well-intentioned care could become form of oppression when it denied the autonomy and growth that healthy development required. Lao and Poppy Beifong's wealth had provided them with resources that most families could never access. Their ability to hire the best tutors and create elaborate safeguards for their daughter's physical security, reflecting genuine concern for her welfare, while also revealing their fundamental misunderstanding of what she actually needed to flourish as individual rather than merely survive as carefully protected invalid, whose potential would never be realized or acknowledged by those who claim to love her most. The elaborate charade that surrounded Toph's public appearances demonstrated how thoroughly her parents had convinced themselves that their deception served her interests rather than their own need to maintain social respectability. Their presentation of her as fragile and helpless, protecting their reputation while denying her the opportunity to develop relationships based on authentic understanding of her character and abilities, rather than pity or condescension that their lies encouraged. The earthbending training that Toph received in secret from the Badger Moles represented rebellion against parental control that was both necessary for her development and dangerous to family harmony. Her nocturnal adventures, providing the only context where she could explore her true nature and capabilities without interference from people who meant well, but whose fear had made them incapable of recognizing what she was actually capable of achieving when given freedom to test her limits. The discovery of her participation in the underground fighting tournaments created crisis that forced all parties to confront the gap between their assumptions and reality. Her parents' shock at learning about her abilities matched by their inability to understand why she had felt compelled to hide such fundamental aspects of her identity from people who claimed to want only her happiness and security. Above all other considerations, the confrontation that followed revealed how thoroughly good intentions could become obstacles to authentic relationship when they were based on misconceptions about what the other person needed or wanted. Toph's anger at being treated as helpless child balanced against her parents' genuine terror at the thought of losing her to dangers that their overprotective approach had prevented them from understanding or addressing through education and preparation rather than isolation and denial. The healing that eventually became possible between Toph and her family required all parties to acknowledge mistakes and limitations that had prevented them from building relationships based on truth rather than comfortable illusions. Their gradual progress toward mutual understanding, demonstrating how love could survive even fundamental disagreements about autonomy and protection, when everyone involved remained committed to growth and honest communication about needs and fears. The bond between Katara and Sokka had been forged through shared trauma that had forced them to become each other's primary source of emotional support during their father's absence and their community's gradual dissolution under pressure from Fire Nation raids. Their relationship encompassing not just sibling affection, but mutual dependence that had shaped their individual development in ways that both strengthened and complicated their separate identities as they matured into young adults with their own goals and relationships. Katara's assumption of maternal responsibilities within their household had created dynamic where she often treated Sokka as another child to be protected and guided, rather than equal partner in managing family obligations. Her bossy tendencies reflecting genuine care, while also creating friction when his own growth and leadership abilities required recognition and respect that her ingrained patterns of behavior made difficult for her to provide naturally or consistently. Sokka's role as the only male of fighting age remaining in their community had burdened him with expectations about protection and leadership that his actual experience and training had not adequately prepared him to fulfill. His boastful exterior masking insecurities about his ability to live up to responsibilities that circumstances had thrust upon him before he had developed the confidence or skills necessary to handle them effectively without constant anxiety about failure. The journey they undertook with Aang provided opportunities for both siblings to discover aspects of themselves that their previous circumstances had not allowed to emerge, their individual talents and capabilities becoming more apparent as they encountered challenges that required different forms of intelligence and courage than their home environment had ever demanded, their growing confidence in their separate abilities, creating space for their relationship to evolve beyond patterns established during childhood. The tensions that occasionally erupted between them during their travels reflected not just typical sibling rivalry, but deeper questions about identity and purpose that war's urgency had prevented them from exploring through normal, developmental processes, their arguments often serving as safe space to express frustrations and fears that they could not acknowledge in other contexts where strength and unity were essential for group survival and effectiveness. The mutual support they provided each other during moments of crisis demonstrated how thoroughly their bond had been tested and strengthened through shared hardship, their intuitive understanding of each other's emotional needs, enabling them to offer exactly the kind of encouragement or comfort that circumstances required, their partnership becoming more effective as both learned to trust each other's judgment and capabilities, rather than relying on childhood roles that no longer served their current situation. The relationship between Zuko and Iroh represented perhaps the most profound example of chosen family transcending blood relations to create bond based on genuine understanding and mutual care, rather than obligation or social expectation. Their connection developing through shared experiences of loss and exile that had stripped away pretenses and revealed character qualities that palace life had either hidden or prevented from developing through authentic interaction and honest communication. Iroh's patient guidance during their years of banishment reflected wisdom gained through his own experiences of failure and redemption, his understanding that Zuko's anger and frustration were symptoms of deeper confusion about identity and purpose, enabling him to provide exactly the kind of support that traditional authority figures had never offered. His willingness to meet Zuko where he was, rather than demanding immediate transformation, demonstrating love that honored individual growth patterns, rather than imposing external expectations. The gradual healing of Zuko's psychological wounds occurred through countless small interactions that demonstrated unconditional acceptance while gently encouraging reflection and growth. Iroh's storytelling and philosophical observations creating safe space for his nephew to examine assumptions and beliefs that had been causing suffering while maintaining dignity and agency in the process of changing perspectives that had become obstacles to happiness and moral development. The tea shop period that brought them closest together as surrogate father and son occurred when external pressures were minimized and they could focus on building relationship based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than survival necessities or political objectives. Their domestic partnership, revealing how thoroughly Iroh had learned to find meaning in simple pleasures and authentic connection rather than seeking validation through power or social recognition. The betrayal that Zuko's return to the Fire Nation represented was devastating, not just because it endangered Iroh physically, but because it seemed to negate years of patient teaching and emotional investment. The old general's imprisonment, becoming symbol of how political pressures could corrupt even relationships that had seemed strong enough to withstand any external challenge or internal conflict that circumstances might create. The reconciliation that followed Zuko's spiritual transformation required both to acknowledge how political loyalties and family obligations had interfered with their personal bond, while recognizing that genuine love could survive even fundamental disagreements about duty and moral priorities, when both parties remained committed to each other's welfare rather than demanding conformity to their own perspectives and expectations. Tenzin's struggle to live up to his father's legacy while developing his own identity and approach to leadership reflected broader questions about how children of extraordinary parents could honor their heritage without becoming prisoners of expectations that might not align with their individual talents and interests. His journey towards self-acceptance requiring balance between respect for tradition and recognition of changed circumstances that demanded new approaches to familiar challenges. The pressure that Avatar Aang's reputation created for his son was intensified by the knowledge that he might be the only person capable of preserving air nomad culture for future generations. The weight of entire civilization's survival resting upon someone whose primary desire was to be good father and teacher rather than symbol or savior. His growing confidence in his own abilities, enabling him to serve both personal and cosmic purposes without sacrificing either. The evolution of Varrick and Julie's relationship from employer-employee dynamic to genuine partnership demonstrated how professional relationships could develop emotional depths when both parties remained open to growth, change, their eventual marriage representing triumph of authentic connection over social conventions, while also showing how power imbalances could be overcome through mutual respect and recognition of each person's essential worth and contribution to shared endeavors. The family healing that became possible in the post-war world required multiple generations to examine patterns of behavior and relationship that had been shaped by conflict and survival necessities. Their willingness to break cycles of dysfunction and create new approaches to love and support, demonstrating how conscious effort could transform inherited trauma into wisdom that served future generations rather than perpetuating damage that war and oppression had inflicted upon their communities and individual psyches. The accelerated pace at which romantic relationships developed during wartime reflected not just the heightened emotions that constant danger created, but also the practical reality that any moment together might be the last opportunity for connection and intimacy. Couples who might have spent years in careful courtship under peaceful circumstances, finding themselves deeply committed after mere weeks or months of shared experiences that tested their compatibility under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The refugee camps that dotted the landscape throughout the Earth Kingdom became unexpected venues for romance, as displaced people from different regions and backgrounds found themselves thrown together in circumstances that broke down social barriers and cultural prejudices, their shared suffering, creating bonds that transcended the class distinctions and national loyalties that had previously determined who could associate with whom. Their connections forged through mutual dependence for survival and comfort in the face of losses that seemed too great to bear alone. The young couples who met while fleeing advancing Fire Nation armies often had only days or weeks to build relationships before circumstances separated them again. Their hurried courtships intensified by awareness that war's chaos could scatter them across vast distances or claim their lives before they had opportunity to explore the full potential of connections that felt profound despite their brief duration, their promises to find each other after the conflict ended, becoming acts of faith in future that seemed increasingly uncertain with each passing month. The soldiers who fell in love during brief respites between battles carried the additional burden of knowing that their military duties might require them to make tactical decisions that could endanger their beloved, their professional obligations potentially conflicting with personal loyalties, in ways that created impossible moral dilemmas about whether love or duty should take precedence, when both served legitimate purposes that seemed equally important to their sense of identity and honor. The medical personnel who worked in field hospitals and healing stations often developed intense relationships with colleagues who shared the emotional stress of trying to save lives under impossible conditions, their partnerships sustained by mutual understanding of trauma that civilians could never comprehend, while also tested by constant exposure to suffering and death that could overwhelm even the strongest psychological defenses and emotional reserves. The underground resistance networks that operated in Fire Nation occupied territories created environments where romantic connections carried additional risks beyond normal relationship challenges. The lovers who supported each other's clandestine activities, knowing that capture could mean torture and execution, while their personal bonds provided both motivation for continued resistance and potential weakness that enemies could exploit through threats against those they cared about most deeply. The period of adjustment that followed Firelord Ozai's defeat brought different but equally challenging circumstances for couples who had built their relationships during wartime, their partnerships suddenly requiring renegotiation when survival was no longer primary concern, and they needed to discover whether connections forged in crisis could adapt to circumstances that allowed for reflection, personal growth, and the kind of ordinary daily life that war had made impossible for so long. The veterans who returned to communities that had been transformed by years of conflict often found that their relationships with sweethearts or spouses who had remained behind required extensive healing and rebuilding. The shared experiences and psychological changes that combat had created, making it difficult to reconnect with people who had not undergone similar transformations. Their loved ones struggling to understand behavior and emotional needs that peaceful existence had not prepared them to recognize or address. The widows and widowers who had lost partners during the conflict faced unique challenges in forming new relationships, their grief complicated by guilt about moving forward emotionally, while maintaining loyalty to deceased spouses whose memory remained vivid and important. Their potential new partners needing to navigate complex emotional terrain that included honoring the past while building foundations for different but equally meaningful future connections. The reconstruction efforts that occupied the immediate post-war years created opportunities for romance between people who might never have met under ordinary circumstances. The massive projects required to rebuild cities and restore agricultural systems, bringing together individuals from different nations and backgrounds who discovered compatibility through shared commitment to healing the damage that conflict had inflicted upon both physical infrastructure and social relationships. The peace negotiations and diplomatic missions that characterized early reconstruction provided settings where political enemies gradually became personal friends and sometimes romantic partners, their initial interactions governed by suspicion and formal protocol, slowly evolving into genuine appreciation for individual character and shared values that transcended the national loyalties and ideological differences that had previously made meaningful relationship impossible. The international marriages that began to occur between former enemies represented both personal happiness and symbolic healing for communities that had spent decades viewing each other as irredeemably hostile, their children becoming living bridges between cultures, while their partnerships demonstrated possibility for reconciliation and cooperation that extended far beyond individual relationships to encompass broader patterns of international understanding and mutual respect. The different approaches that various generations took toward romantic relationships reflected how war had influenced their understanding of love's role in human life. The older couples who had lived through decades of conflict, often approaching partnership with caution born from experience of loss, while younger people who had known only war sometimes rushed into relationships with intensity that their elders found both inspiring and concerning in its disregard for potential consequences. The hope that sustained love through the darkest periods of conflict was not based on naive optimism, but on profound understanding of what made life worth living, even when circumstances seemed designed to crush everything beautiful and meaningful. The couples who maintained their bonds through separation and danger, drawing strength from conviction that their connection represented something eternal that external forces could threaten but never completely destroy. The letters that lovers exchanged during periods of separation became treasured documents that preserved not just personal feelings, but historical records of how ordinary people maintained humanity and hope during extraordinary circumstances, their words revealing depth of emotion and commitment that official histories rarely captured, while providing intimate glimpses into experiences that shaped entire generations' understanding of what relationships could endure when the fact, supported by genuine dedication. The wedding ceremonies that took place in liberated territories carried significance that went beyond personal celebration to encompass community affirmation of life's triumph over death, their festivities serving as declarations that beauty and joy could be rebuilt from ruins of everything that war had destroyed, their participants demonstrating faith in future that would allow love to flourish without constant threat of violent interruption. The elderly couples who had maintained their partnerships through decades of conflict became symbols of endurance and wisdom for younger generations, seeking guidance about how to build relationships capable of surviving whatever challenges the future might bring, their advice often emphasizing importance of mutual support and shared commitment to values that transcended immediate circumstances while maintaining flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. The resistance movements that had operated throughout the occupied territories often included romantic partnerships that had developed through shared commitment to liberation and justice. Their relationships tested not only by external dangers, but by moral complexities of fighting against oppression, while maintaining humanity and compassion for enemies who were also victims of systems that reduced individuals to instruments of political power rather than recognizing their inherent worth. The cultural exchanges that became possible during peacetime revealed how different traditions approached romantic relationships and family formation, the exposure to alternative perspectives, creating opportunities for individuals to examine their own assumptions while choosing elements from various customs that served their particular circumstances and values, rather than simply accepting inherited patterns without consideration of their continued relevance and effectiveness. The music and poetry that emerged from wartime experiences of love and loss created artistic legacy that preserved memory of what relationships could accomplish when faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles, their themes of devotion transcending death and separation, inspiring future generations while honoring sacrifice of those whose love stories had been cut short by violence that served no constructive purpose beyond satisfying destructive impulses that peace would eventually prove unnecessary. The healing rituals and ceremonies that communities developed to address trauma created contexts where couples could process shared experiences of loss and survival, while strengthening bonds that had been tested by circumstances beyond normal human endurance. Their collective acknowledgement of suffering providing foundation for renewal that honored both individual pain and community resilience, while looking forward to possibilities that war had temporarily obscured. The children who were born during the final years of conflict and the early years of peace became symbols of hope and continuity for parents who had endured losses that seemed to threaten the very meaning of bringing new life into a world that had shown such capacity for cruelty, their existence representing triumph of love over fear and commitment to future that would be shaped by lessons learned through suffering, but not defined entirely by trauma and destruction. The international adoption programs that reunited families separated by war created new forms of kinship that transcended biological relationships while honoring cultural heritage. The parents who opened their homes to children from former enemy nations, demonstrating love's capacity to overcome prejudice and create bonds based on choice rather than mere genetic connection, their families becoming models for integration that served broader social healing. The relationships that flourish throughout the Avatar universe offer profound lessons about the essential elements that distinguish healthy partnerships from those that become sources of suffering and limitation rather than growth and mutual support. Their varied outcomes demonstrating how individual choices about respect, communication, and shared values determine whether romantic connections enhance or diminish the lives of everyone involved while influencing broader patterns of social harmony and cultural development that extend far beyond immediate participants. The foundation of every healthy relationship represented in these stories rests upon genuine equality between partners who recognize each other as complete individuals, deserving of respect and consideration rather than objects to be possessed or manipulated for personal satisfaction. Their interactions characterized by mutual recognition of autonomy and dignity that allows both people to maintain their essential identity while growing through shared experiences and collaborative decision-making that serves everyone's authentic needs and aspirations. Sokka and Suki exemplified this principle through their evolution from initial misunderstanding to mature partnership built on appreciation for each other's strengths and acceptance of individual differences. Their relationship demonstrating how genuine love could transform prejudice into wisdom while creating space for both people to become their best selves through encouragement and support that honored rather than threatened their separate identities and capabilities. The importance of honest communication emerges as a crucial factor in determining relationship success, with couples who maintained open dialogue about their feelings, concerns, and expectations proving more resilient than those who relied on assumptions or avoided difficult conversations that might have prevented minor misunderstandings from developing into relationship-threatening conflicts that damaged trust and emotional intimacy over time. Aang and Katara's journey toward mature partnership required both to learn how to express their needs and listen to each other's perspectives without allowing their individual insecurities or external pressures to interfere with honest exchange of thoughts and feelings, their growth as communicators, enabling them to navigate challenges that might have destroyed relationships, lacking such foundation of mutual understanding and respect for each other's emotional reality. The toxic relationships portrayed throughout these stories consistently featured patterns of control, manipulation, and emotional abuse that reduced partners to instruments serving one person's desires, rather than recognizing them as equal participants in shared endeavor. Their dysfunctions stemming from fundamental failure to acknowledge the other person's inherent worth and right to autonomy, happiness, and personal growth that healthy relationships were meant to support rather than suppress. Boland's experience with Esker illustrated how quickly romantic attraction could become prison when one partner viewed the other as possession rather than person. Her controlling behavior and threats of violence, creating atmosphere of fear that prevented authentic intimacy, while demonstrating how power imbalances could corrupt even relationships that began with genuine affection and mutual interest. In building meaningful connection, the role of personal maturity in relationship success becomes evident through comparison of partnerships that developed between individuals who had achieved emotional stability and self-awareness versus those involving people who remained trapped in patterns of behavior, shaped by unresolved trauma or psychological dysfunction that prevented them from participating in healthy dynamics, requiring vulnerability, compromise, and genuine concern for another person's welfare. Zuko and Mai's relationship required both to overcome significant emotional barriers before they could build partnership based on authentic connection rather than superficial attraction or temporary convenience. Their eventual success reflecting individual growth that enabled them to appreciate each other's true nature while developing communication skills necessary for navigating differences without destroying fundamental bond that united them, despite personality contrasts that initially created friction. The spiritual dimensions of romantic love that permeate Avatar universe relationships suggest that healthy partnerships serve purposes beyond individual happiness to encompass mutual support for each person's journey toward greater wisdom and compassion, their connections creating opportunities for learning and growth that neither could achieve alone while contributing to broader patterns of healing and transformation that influenced entire communities and cultures. The transcendence of traditional boundaries that characterized several successful relationships demonstrated how authentic love could overcome artificial divisions based on nationality, social class, or other external categories when both individuals remained committed to seeing beyond surface differences to recognize shared humanity and compatible values that provided foundation for genuine partnership regardless of backgrounds that might seem incompatible to outside observers. Korra and Asami's evolution from rivalry to deep romantic connection illustrated how relationships could transform when people approached each other with openness and willingness to revise initial impressions based on growing understanding of character qualities that were more significant than superficial differences or competitive dynamics that had initially shaped their interactions through circumstances beyond their individual control. The importance of timing in relationship development appears throughout these stories as a factor that could determine whether compatible people successfully built lasting partnerships or remained forever separated by circumstances that prevented their connection from reaching its full potential. Their experiences suggesting that love required not just mutual attraction and compatibility, but also alignment of external conditions that allowed relationships to develop naturally without overwhelming pressure or interference. The balance between individual identity and shared commitment that healthy relationships required involved ongoing negotiation between personal autonomy and partnership obligations. Successful couples learning to maintain their essential selves while growing through connection that enhanced rather than diminished their individual capabilities and contributions to purposes larger than immediate relationship satisfaction. The healing power of authentic affection became evident in relationships that enabled individuals to overcome trauma and psychological wounds that had previously limited their capacity for trust and emotional intimacy, their partners providing safe space for vulnerability and growth, while demonstrating through consistent behavior that love could be source of strength rather than weakness when approached with wisdom and genuine commitment to each other's well-being. The intergenerational patterns that influenced relationship approaches showed how family dysfunction could be transmitted across generations, while also demonstrating possibility for conscious individuals to break cycles of abuse and create healthier models for their children, their efforts requiring courage to examine inherited assumptions while developing new approaches that served authentic human needs rather than perpetuating damage. The role of shared values and compatible life goals in sustaining long-term partnerships emerged as crucial factor, distinguishing relationships that endured from those that ultimately failed despite initial attraction and emotional connection. Couples who aligned their individual purposes with collective vision proving more resilient than those whose fundamental beliefs and aspirations remained in conflict throughout their time together. The community context within which relationships developed influenced their success through social support or pressure that either encouraged healthy dynamics or created obstacles to authentic connection. The couples who thrived often benefiting from cultural environments that honored individual choice while providing guidance and wisdom about building partnerships that served both personal happiness and collective welfare. The courage required to love authentically in dangerous circumstances revealed how genuine affection could inspire individuals to transcend normal limitations and risk everything for another person's welfare. Their willingness to sacrifice comfort and safety, demonstrating love's power to transform ordinary people into heroes whose actions influenced not just their immediate relationships, but broader patterns of hope and possibility. The evolution of relationship understanding across different generations within Avatar Universe reflected broader social progress toward recognition that healthy partnerships required equality, respect, and mutual support rather than traditional power structures that privileged some individuals at expense of others. Their changing approaches demonstrating how conscious effort could create more just and fulfilling forms of human connection. The legacy of love stories that emerged from this rich narrative universe continues to influence contemporary understanding of what relationships could achieve when approached with wisdom, courage, and commitment to growth that honored both individual authenticity and shared responsibility for creating conditions where all people could flourish through connections that enhanced rather than limited their capacity for happiness, creativity, and contribution to collective healing and transformation that served purposes greater than immediate personal satisfaction, while remaining deeply meaningful to those whose lives were touched by genuine love. As our journey through these tales of the heart draws to its gentle close, we're reminded that love, in all its forms, remains the most powerful force in the Avatar universe. From the passionate intensity of fire and shadow to the steady devotion of warriors united, from the impossible romance of mortal and spirit to the quiet revolution of hearts, finding unexpected connection. Each story teaches us that love adapts, endures, and ultimately transcends every boundary we might imagine. These couples, with all their struggles and triumphs, show us that the greatest adventures are not always found in mastering the elements, but in opening our hearts to another soul. As you drift toward peaceful dreams, carry with you the warmth of their devotions, the courage of their choices, and the eternal hope that love, like the Avatar spirit itself, continues across lifetimes, finding new forms but never truly ending. Rest now, surrounded by the knowledge that somewhere in the vast tapestry of existence, love stories continue to unfold, as gentle and enduring as the turning of the seasons themselves.